In recent years, anxiety, depression, and mental distress have skyrocketed among young people. The rise has been so sharp and widespread that it suggests something more than just the usual ups and downs of adolescence. Something fundamental has shifted, affecting the way children grow, interact, and see themselves. Many theories have been proposed, from academic pressure to economic instability, but one explanation stands out: a dramatic transformation in childhood itself. For thousands of years, children have learned through direct experience, exploration, and face-to-face interaction. They played outside, took risks, made mistakes, and discovered their own capabilities. But within a single generation, childhood has been profoundly altered. The shift away from free play and toward screen-based activities has led to a striking new pattern of behavior, one that closely aligns with the rise in anxiety and depression. The transition from an active, self-directed childhood to a sedentary, highly structured, and digitally dominated one has created an environment where kids are more fragile, more fearful, and less equipped to navigate the real world. This is not just a matter of correlation, but of cause and effect, as mounting research shows the deep psychological consequences of growing up in a digital-first era. Understanding this crisis requires looking beyond the surface. It's not simply about too much screen time or the usual warnings about social media. The issue runs deeper, involving a fundamental rewiring of the way children interact with their environment. The transformation has taken place so rapidly that parents, educators, and policymakers have struggled to keep up. What was once a normal childhood, filled with independence, trial and error, and physical activity, has been replaced by an overprotected, digitally immersed, and constantly surveilled experience. The impact is profound, affecting not just individual children, but the entire fabric of society. This book explores the origins and consequences of this shift. It examines the factors that led to the anxious generation, from changes in parenting styles to the rise of smartphone culture. It delves into the neurological and psychological effects of growing up in an environment dominated by screens and social media. Most importantly, it offers solutions, presenting a path forward for parents, schools, and communities to help restore a healthier, more resilient childhood. The goal is not to turn back time, but to recognize what has been lost and take deliberate steps to bring back the essential experiences that allow children to thrive. Part 1. A Tidal Wave. The rise of anxiety, depression, and mental health struggles among young people did not happen overnight. It came like a tidal wave, growing quietly for years before crashing down with force. The data shows a dramatic shift around the early 2010s, when rates of self-harm, suicidal thoughts, and emotional distress among teenagers began to skyrocket. Something had changed, and it wasn't just a random fluctuation. Across multiple countries, cultures, and demographics, the trend pointed to a deep and systemic issue rather than individual circumstances. At first, many suspected traditional causes: economic struggles, academic pressure, or even overprotective parenting. But these explanations did not fully account for the unprecedented rise in mental health disorders. Studies found that the most significant increases in anxiety and depression occurred among girls, particularly teenage girls, who were suddenly reporting record-high levels of distress. Boys, too, were affected, but not as dramatically. This gender divide raised questions about whether the shift was linked to specific aspects of modern childhood. Further research revealed a major shift in the way young people spent their time. Childhood had once been defined by independence, riding bikes around the neighborhood, playing outside for hours, and forming deep, in-person friendships. But as the 2010s progressed, that world disappeared. Social media platforms like Instagram, Snapchat, and later TikTok became central to teenage life. For the first time in history, an entire generation moved their social interactions online. This shift wasn't gradual, it was abrupt, and its consequences were profound. Instead of engaging in real-world activities that built resilience and social skills, many teenagers found themselves trapped in a cycle of endless scrolling, comparison, and digital validation. Girls, in particular, were drawn into a world of social media curation, where every post, every like, and every comment carried emotional weight. Studies confirmed that the more time a young person spent on these platforms, the more likely they were to experience anxiety, depression, and body image issues. The digital world, once seen as an extension of reality, had begun to replace it, and in doing so, it rewired the way young people experienced their own self-worth. Meanwhile, boys were being pulled into their own digital distractions. While social media dominated teenage girls' attention, many boys became deeply immersed in video games and online forums. These spaces were less about self-presentation and more about escape. Gaming provided an alternative reality, one where achievements were clear, progress was measurable, and social interactions required less vulnerability. But as boys spent more time in digital worlds, they spent less time developing real-world confidence, problem-solving skills, and emotional resilience. The consequences of this digital shift were staggering. Schools saw an increase in students struggling with focus, emotional regulation, and basic social skills. Therapists reported a surge of young clients overwhelmed by anxiety, many of whom had no prior history of mental health issues. Parents found themselves locked in battles over screen time, unsure how to set boundaries in a world where everything, from education to friendships, seemed to depend on digital access. The tidal wave of youth mental health issues wasn't just a coincidence, it was the result of a fundamental change in childhood itself. The shift from outdoor play to indoor screens, from face-to-face interactions to digital communication, and from gradual social development to instant online feedback had created a generation that felt more isolated, insecure, and anxious than ever before. But to understand why this happened, it was necessary to go back even further, to the choices and cultural shifts that laid the groundwork for this transformation. Part 2. The backstory. To understand why today's youth are struggling, we have to look at the cultural and societal shifts that led to this moment. The crisis didn't emerge in isolation. It was built on decades of changes in parenting, education, and technology. Each small adjustment, though well-intentioned, contributed to an environment that ultimately made children less prepared to handle the challenges of adulthood. One of the most significant changes was the rise of overprotective parenting. In previous generations, childhood was defined by freedom. Kids played outside unsupervised, walked to school alone, and handled conflicts without adult intervention. But as crime rates surged in the 1980s and 1990s, parents became increasingly cautious. The phrase stranger danger became widely known, and news stories about child abductions fueled parental fears. Though crime rates eventually declined, the fear remained, leading parents to adopt more controlling approaches to child rearing. Schools followed suit. Zero-tolerance policies, anti-bullying campaigns, and strict behavioral guidelines aimed to make childhood as safe as possible. But in doing so, they removed opportunities for kids to develop conflict resolution skills. If a disagreement arose on the playground, an adult stepped in immediately. If a student felt uncomfortable with a topic in class, policies were put in place to protect them from distress. Over time, this created a generation less accustomed to discomfort, less equipped to handle adversity, and more reliant on institutional safeguards. Simultaneously, a shift in educational priorities placed academic success above all else. Standardized testing, college admissions pressure, and the belief that childhood should be a non-stop journey toward achievement turned schools into high-stakes environments. Playtime was reduced, recess was cut, and unstructured activities gave way to structured programs aimed at producing high-performing students. This robbed kids of opportunities to develop autonomy, problem-solving skills, and the ability to navigate uncertainty. As childhood became more structured and supervised, technology was rapidly advancing. The introduction of the smartphone in 2007 was a turning point, but its full impact wouldn't be felt until a few years later. In the early 2010s, as social media platforms optimized their algorithms for engagement, they became addictive digital environments designed to capture attention. This coincided with a decline in real-world social interactions. Kids who once spent hours riding bikes, playing sports, or simply hanging out in person were now communicating primarily through screens. For girls, this shift meant an increased reliance on social validation. Instead of navigating friendships in real life, where emotions, body language, and social cues played a role, many were engaging in highly curated, often toxic, digital environments. Likes, comments, and follows became metrics for self-worth, reinforcing perfectionism and self-comparison. A single post could bring a flood of approval, or, just as easily, a wave of criticism. Anxiety skyrocketed as social interactions became more performative and high stakes. For boys, digital spaces offered a different kind of escape. While girls were drawn into social media, boys turned to gaming and online forums. Video games provided a sense of mastery, progression, and social connection in a way that real-world activities often did not. Online forums, particularly in niche or anonymous communities, became places where boys could explore their identities without the same pressures of real-world interaction. But these digital worlds often came at the expense of real-life development, leaving many boys struggling with motivation, focus, and real-world social skills. By the late 2010s, these trends had fully taken hold. Kids were spending more time online, less time engaging in real-world play, and facing more academic pressure than ever before. Meanwhile, parents and schools, in their attempts to create a safe and structured childhood, had inadvertently removed the very experiences that help kids develop resilience. The result was a generation that felt less prepared, more anxious, and increasingly disconnected from reality. This set the stage for what came next, the Great Rewiring of childhood itself. With digital life taking over and real-world experiences diminishing, the very way young people thought, interacted, and developed was changing at a fundamental level. Part 3. The Great Rewiring. By the 2010s, childhood had undergone a transformation unlike anything seen before. It wasn't just that kids were spending more time online, it was that their entire way of thinking, feeling, and relating to the world was being reshaped. Social media, smartphones, and the decline of real-world experiences didn't just change how children communicated. They altered brain development, social patterns, and emotional resilience. The result was a deep, structural shift in the very nature of growing up. The human brain is designed to develop through direct, real-world interactions. For millennia, children learned by playing, taking risks, making mistakes, and figuring out how to navigate the social complexities of life. But as screens took over, these fundamental experiences began to disappear. Playgrounds became empty. Teenagers no longer hung out at malls, parks, or each other's houses as they once did. Socialization moved almost entirely online, and with it came an entirely new set of psychological pressures. For young girls, social media became an omnipresent force, shaping their self-image and emotional well-being. Platforms like Instagram and TikTok, designed for visual engagement, turned everyday interactions into public performances. What had once been a private, natural process of self-discovery became an anxiety-inducing spectacle. Every post was scrutinized, every comment had the potential to wound, and every interaction was visible for all to see. Social comparison, always a challenge for adolescents, reached new and dangerous heights. Girls who might have once compared themselves to a handful of peers in their school were now comparing themselves to influencers, celebrities, and an endless stream of curated perfection. The consequences were staggering. Rates of anxiety, depression, and self-harm among teenage girls began to rise sharply around 2012, coinciding almost perfectly with the mass adoption of Instagram and Snapchat. As face-to-face socialization declined, girls became increasingly trapped in an endless cycle of self-doubt, perfectionism, and digital validation seeking. Their identities were being shaped not through personal experience, but through the lens of an algorithm designed to exploit their insecurities. For boys, the rewiring took a different but equally damaging form. While girls were drawn into social media's emotional and aesthetic pressures, boys increasingly retreated into the world of video games and online communities. Gaming had always been popular, but the rise of highly immersive, endlessly rewarding online games created a new kind of addiction. Games like Fortnite, Call of Duty, and Minecraft provided an escape from the pressures of school, social life, and family expectations. Unlike the structured, demanding world of school, gaming offered immediate gratification, a sense of mastery, and an environment where social interaction felt easier and less judgmental. But as gaming hours piled up, boys found themselves disengaged from the real world. School felt boring, social interactions felt awkward, and motivation to pursue long-term goals diminished. Many struggled to develop the resilience, discipline, and emotional intelligence needed to navigate adulthood. Meanwhile, some boys, feeling disconnected from mainstream culture, turned to online forums that ranged from supportive communities to toxic extremist spaces. The online world became a double-edged sword, offering both connection and isolation, guidance and misguidance, empowerment and disillusionment. As digital life took over, key developmental milestones were being skipped. Risk-taking, an essential part of growing up, was vanishing. In the past, teenagers pushed boundaries by sneaking out, taking road trips, or trying new experiences with friends. Real-world risks that taught responsibility, consequences, and independence. But today's teens were taking far fewer physical risks and far more psychological ones. Instead of experimenting with real-world independence, they were posting personal details online, exposing themselves to cyberbullying, and navigating high-stakes social interactions in a space where nothing was ever truly forgotten. One of the most concerning aspects of this shift was its impact on emotional resilience. In previous generations, kids encountered stress, failure, and conflict in manageable, real-world doses. They learned to deal with disappointment, handle disagreements, and navigate difficult emotions. But with the rise of digital childhood, the very mechanisms that build resilience were fading away. Instead of facing minor failures and learning from them, kids were shielded from discomfort, only to be overwhelmed by far greater emotional challenges later on. The evidence was undeniable. Mental health crises among young people skyrocketed. Anxiety and depression rates doubled in less than a decade. Suicide rates among teenagers, particularly girls, climbed at an alarming rate. And yet for years, society failed to connect the dots. Many blamed academic pressure, economic uncertainty, or even genetics. But the data told a clearer story. The rewiring of childhood through digital technology was at the center of it all. This was not just a small shift, it was a revolution in human development. The childhood of today bore little resemblance to the childhood of just a generation ago. And unless something changed, the mental health crisis among young people would only worsen. That led to the critical question: what could be done? Was it too late to reverse course? Or was there a way to restore the balance between digital life and real-world development? The answer lay in collective action, a fundamental rethinking of how society approaches childhood, technology, and mental well-being. Part 4. Collective Action for Healthier Childhood. If the rewiring of childhood has led to an explosion of anxiety, depression, and emotional fragility, then the logical next step is to ask, what can we do about it? Can we restore balance to the lives of young people, or has the digital world become too deeply ingrained? The answer is clear. Reform is possible, but it requires a collective effort from parents, educators, policymakers, and even the tech companies themselves. The shift must not be left to individuals alone because the pressures that drive kids into digital dependence are systemic. Just as societies have adapted to previous public health crises, whether through seatbelt laws, anti-smoking campaigns, or food safety regulations, so too must we act decisively to reclaim childhood from the grip of constant screen exposure. One of the first steps in this process is to delay children's full immersion into social media and smartphones. Research shows that children who spend more time in real-world interactions and less time on screens tend to have stronger emotional resilience and mental health. Some communities have already begun taking action, launching collective agreements among parents to delay smartphone ownership and social media use until later adolescence. The idea is simple. If enough families agree to hold the line together, the social pressure for kids to get a phone at an early age diminishes. This approach has proven successful in certain school districts and parent groups, demonstrating that collective action can effectively push back against the normalization of early smartphone dependence. But delaying smartphones is just the beginning. Schools play a critical role in shaping the digital habits of young people. One of the most damaging trends in recent years has been the integration of personal devices into the classroom. Many school systems adopted technology without fully understanding the consequences, assuming that digital tools would enhance learning. Instead, they became a source of distraction, fragmented attention, and an erosion of deep thinking. Some of the most successful educational models today, particularly in high-achieving schools, have begun removing smartphones from the classroom altogether, forcing students to engage more deeply with their studies and peers. Another key aspect of the solution is to restore unstructured, real-world play. In past generations, children spent hours outside, playing with friends, inventing games, and engaging in physically and socially demanding activities. These experiences weren't just fun, they were essential for emotional development. Unstructured play helps children learn negotiation, conflict resolution, risk-taking, and resilience. Yet modern childhood has become overly structured, with organized activities replacing free play and digital entertainment replacing face-to-face interaction. Some communities are now working to reintroduce these essential experiences by encouraging outdoor play initiatives and creating safe, accessible spaces where children can interact without constant adult supervision. Tech companies themselves must also be held accountable for the addictive nature of their platforms. While the industry has been reluctant to accept responsibility, growing pressure from researchers, lawmakers, and public health experts has led to discussions about regulation. Some propose age restrictions for social media, much like those applied to alcohol and tobacco. Others advocate for changes to algorithms that prioritize engagement over well-being, making platforms less exploitative of young users' psychological vulnerabilities. The challenge, of course, is that tech companies profit from keeping users engaged as long as possible. Without significant external pressure, these companies have little incentive to make meaningful changes. But beyond restrictions, the ultimate goal is to cultivate a new cultural norm, one that prioritizes childhood as a time of growth, learning, and social development, rather than a race to digital dependence. This shift will require a rethinking of modern parenting, where the emphasis is placed on fostering independence, resilience, and real-world competence, rather than hypervigilance and digital pacification. Parents must reclaim their role in setting boundaries around screen time, not as individual enforcers, but as part of a broader cultural movement that redefines what it means to raise a healthy child in the digital age. Perhaps the most important lesson in all of this is that childhood cannot be outsourced to algorithms. If we leave it up to tech companies, social media influencers, and digital trends to shape the next generation, we will continue to see rising rates of anxiety, depression, and social disconnection. But if families, schools, and communities take an active role in reclaiming childhood, there is hope for a healthier, more resilient generation. The stakes could not be higher. A generation raised on screens is a generation at risk, not just in terms of mental health, but in terms of social cohesion, civic engagement, and the very fabric of human connection. The challenge is immense, but so is the opportunity. If society comes together to restore a healthier balance between technology and real-world experience, the future does not have to be one of endless anxiety. It can be one where children grow up with the confidence, resilience, and social skills they need to thrive in the real world. That wraps up this deep dive into the anxious generation. The book paints a sobering yet hopeful picture of how the digital age has reshaped childhood, often for the worse, and what can be done to correct course. The explosion of anxiety and depression among young people is not an inevitable consequence of modern life, but rather the result of specific choices made by parents, schools, and tech companies. The good news is that these choices can be changed. The book reveals that the solution is not about eliminating technology altogether, but about restoring balance. Childhood should not be a series of passive, screen-based experiences, but a journey of real-world interactions, challenges, and personal growth. By delaying smartphones, restricting social media, bringing back free play, and limiting distractions in schools, we can give children the chance to develop resilience, independence, and emotional well-being. These changes won't happen overnight, and they require collective action. Families, educators, policymakers, and even tech companies must all play a role. The digital world is not going away, nor should it. Technology offers immense benefits, but the way it is currently designed and consumed by young people is harming their mental health and social development. If we want to raise a generation that is confident, emotionally strong, and capable of forming deep human connections, we must rethink how we integrate digital tools into their lives. The alternative, a generation of anxious, fragile individuals disconnected from the real world, is simply not acceptable. This book is ultimately a call to action. The future of childhood is still in our hands, and the steps we take today will determine whether the next generation grows up stronger, healthier, and more prepared for the challenges of life. The time to act is now. Thank you so much for listening and joining us. If you enjoy the audiobook, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to stay updated with more book summaries that can expand your mind. Drop a comment below to let us know which book you like us to explore next. We look forward to bringing you more valuable contents right here on Page by Page. Until next time, keep learning and growing.